Chapter 6 Interpretations. Art has no haters but the ignorant. A golden and blessed casket of nature's marvels by Benedictus Figulus, 1607 AD. The alchemical writings are obscure and often misinterpreted. Since the writings are so obscure, it's a perfect discipline for someone who wants to look more important than they are to pretend to understand. As long as no one else understands it either, then they can safely go on misleading people and pretending to be important and mystical. I want to make it clear that there is only one correct interpretation. I will discuss some common alternative interpretations and misunderstandings in this chapter. The modern popular opinion is that alchemy is a spiritual discipline. This idea arose in the 19th and early 20th centuries, along with theosophical movement and occult revival. The reason for its popularity was simply because it was a way for people who don't understand the obscure terms to pretend that they do understand them. These people proceeded to write books themselves on spiritual alchemy, which are mere folly. The spiritual interpretation of alchemy that was made famous by Jung, in fact, reflects religious convictions typical of 19th century occultism and is not supported by the antique and medieval alchemical sources. On the Edge of the Future by Jeffrey John Cripple and Glenn W. Schuck, 2005. Spiritual alchemy only became believable when the philosopher's stone was no longer believed in. Prior to the 19th century, no single person ever wrote anything about alchemy being spiritual. This only started when alchemy fell into disrepute. It was clear to many self-styled philosophers in the 19th century that alchemy had been praised and studied by so many great minds throughout history. The only way to explain this was to 1. Either admit that they were not wise enough to work out how to make the stone, or 2. Pretend that they were wise enough by inventing an alternative interpretation. Spiritual alchemy appeared to make sense of the writings of the alchemists, assuming that the philosopher's stone is not real, and only if one were to read selectively just a few alchemical books. The way of the spiritual interpreters is to find any word that could sound spiritual, such as spirit, body, living gold, philosophical mercury, etc. They then jump on this word as evidence of their claim, even though it is evident that these words refer to either the water or salt of the substance from which we make the stone. Unfortunately, many alchemical classics were adulterated during the 19th century, e.g. Corpus Hermeticum, in order to make them sound more spiritual. At the same time, new spiritual alchemy books were published under the name of older alchemists, when they were in fact new publications. Although it is easy to tell the cultural origin of books by the style of writing, these books continue to fool people and are used as sources to support the spiritual interpretation. Hundreds of books, including adulterated translations of alchemical classics, appeared in the second half of the 19th century, all but a very few embracing this new spiritual interpretation of alchemy. Newton and Newtonianism by James E. Force and Sarah Hutton, 2005. The spiritual interpreters go further by suggesting that the alchemists had to hide their spiritual philosophy under obscurity, since the kings and the church in their time would have prosecuted them for blasphemy. This claim sounds believable if we are to read it and nod our heads without thinking about it, but if we think about it, we see that 1. Various saints and monks in the same period spoke very clearly about spirituality without any problem, and 2. The kings and church were actually prosecuting the alchemists anyways. 3. Since the alchemists were already being prosecuted for claiming they can make gold, all they would have to do is admit they were actually talking about spirituality and they would be safe. A purely spiritual alchemy would never explain the existence of alchemical laboratories in which physicians honestly and fanatically sought for occult medicines. Man, Myth, and Magic by Richard Cavendish and Brian Innes, 1983. Spiritual alchemy is the emperor's new clothes. Everyone pretends to understand it, but no one really does. There is nobody on earth who could explain the why and how of spiritual alchemy and successfully decode entire alchemical books using this interpretation. This is why the idea has stuck, simply because no one understands it, and so there is no argument against those who believe it. As how can you argue against someone who blindly believes something with no evidence? That being said, since the creation of the philosopher's stone does follow fundamental laws of nature, and since fundamental laws hold true on every level and every situation, then the same laws which apply to the creation of the stone also hold true to spiritual development. But the spiritual interpreters of alchemy don't follow those fundamental laws, since they don't understand alchemy, and so they are still wrong. My argument against the spiritual interpretations is not that the alchemy does not apply to spirituality. Of course it does. But my argument is against the concept that alchemy is primarily spiritual. Alchemy is primarily concerned with the physical reality, and all the authors of the alchemy books were writing about a physical substance, which is easy to see from the quotes provided in this book. However, all fundamental truths apply on every level, and since the physical reality is a reflection of the spiritual reality, then of course the same does apply to both levels. If the spiritual interpreters of alchemy actually understood alchemy, then they would understand this, and therefore understand that the authors were writing about a physical substance. This is my point. Other people are indeed convinced that alchemy is practical, but they just can't get their head around the fact that it's very simple and follows the laws of nature. Many people have invented chemical processes, e.g., the white stone of urine, which they developed by reading only one or two alchemical books and taking the metaphorical parts of the writings literally. From reading alchemy, they invent complicated chemical processes which are far away from the actions of nature and sit about doing all kinds of fruitless experiments. They obviously get nowhere, and then decide to tell everyone else how to go wrong too. The emperor's new clothes again. I should say a few words about Ormus, also called Ormes or white power gold. We should probably read right, powder gold, which many people are describing and marketing as the philosopher's stone, and I have been asked many times if I am talking about the same thing. Ormus is a method to obtain very small particles of charged metals. This is not the stone, and it is not alchemy. It is not imitating nature. There may be health benefits to ingesting Ormus, but the claim made that Ormus is the stone is a little silly. It's like calling a chicken a cow. A chicken is not a cow. It doesn't look like a cow, and it doesn't act like a cow. Ormus is not made like the stone. It doesn't look like the stone. It doesn't act like the stone. It's not the stone. There is no reason whatsoever for anyone to believe that Ormus is the same as the stone, other than this is what they have previously been told. And if what I am saying here applies to you, then you need to consider what you believe, who you are listening to, and whether you should continue to base your beliefs on the opinions of others presented with no evidence to support their claims. It is very easy to tell if a procedure is true or not. You just ask yourself the following questions. 1. Do I understand how it works? 2. Do I understand why it works? And 3. Does it follow the cycles and laws of nature? If the answer is yes to all these questions, then you are onto something. Nature is the grand master of alchemy and the true teacher. So it is nature to whom you must look to if you intend to base your beliefs on truths. My words in this book will mean nothing to you unless you can sacrifice a little bit of ego and look to nature to see what is true and what is false. Nature has nothing to learn from us, but we have so much to learn from nature. To accept this enables us to listen to what nature has to say, which is all around us, and nature is never wrong. If the interpretation is wrong, then it won't fit, and so you know it's wrong. If one wants to write about spiritual development or chemistry, then this is all fine and dandy. But don't go calling it alchemy. I even came across a modern alchemy book in which the reader is asked not to read the old alchemy books because they are too obscure and will only confuse you. Notwithstanding, the reader is warned against haphazard reading of alchemical books, for this will lead to mental confusion and finally desperation of ever learning anything. Once started on alchemical research, however, this becomes a great temptation and a bad fault. One tends to read voraciously any alchemical book that comes to hand. This one book, closely studied, is, however, all that is necessary for practical experiment. This is impressively ignorant. It looks to me that this author just wants to look cool and mystical, and of course they know that they got nowhere. But they are happy to deceive others and pretend they are important. I apologize to the author, whose name I will mention, for writing against you, but I hope you've learned your lesson. A man who fails to recognize the Wu Xing 5 elements and the 4 signs is certainly one who will be befuddled to differentiate cinnabar, mercury, lead, and silver. He has never even heard of the principle of the fire and the season for the compounding tan, and he dares to say that he is a great devotee of Taoism. Never considering his mistake, he teaches others in turn and teaches mistakenly. He ruins the mercury of others by misleading them into an uncharted port. How can one have the heart to do this? Wu Chen Pian, Essay on the Understanding of Truth by Chang Po Tuan, 1078 A.D., Chinese. With the correct interpretation, as I present in this book, you will understand 1. What alchemy is, 2. Why it works, and 3. How it works. No other interpretation can give you this. They only rely on blind faith, since that is the only way to believe a lie. Notice how I can back up any statement I make in regards to alchemical theory and practice with several quotes from a variety of alchemical books. You will not find this with any other interpretation. Notice how I explain not only how alchemy works, but why alchemy works. Notice how you can actually understand what I say, and it makes sense with nature. This is what truth looks like. But it's been so long since many people have seen truth that they've forgotten what it looks like. It is, of course, all inevitable that the stone would be forgotten and the books misinterpreted. And I don't really mind these misinterpretations in a way, since I had no problem understanding the real alchemical books, which I read before any of the modern literature. But the purpose of my little rant here is to put a stop to further disinformation and lies.